Hi and welcome to RC Cars R Us. This is the second engine video I've uploaded today. This one's about the GX21 engine. As you've seen in previous videos, the crankcase mounting bolts are snapped or destroyed, whatever you want to call it, and I've got a new one to install. So that means stripping down this engine completely and transferring all the bits over to the new crankcase. So at the moment I'm just taking the carburetor pinch bolt out and the carburetor off, and then just releasing the exhaust manifold and taking the head screws out, with the cooling head screws out. Some of these screws are not great. At the time of filming this video, I was in the process of ordering new screws for it. You should probably see it at a later date, where I'll replace all the screws with brand new ones. I think some of them were different sizes as well. Not different sizes as in the actual pitch and the thread, just the actual head size was different. So you can see now that I'm removing the clutch bell. In the last video I looked at this and it had two roller bearings in. The bearing upgrade was on its way by the time I was filming this video, so I was just waiting for them to drop through the door. So now taking the clutch out and then taking the pilot shaft off the actual engine, and take the flywheel off. So I'm just removing the pull start now. So as you can see, I've taken the pull starter off. I was a bit worried about that, whether the spring was gonna explode in my face, so I took it out very carefully. The one-way bearing gripped the actual starting shaft pretty well, so I'm happy that the one-way bearings are pretty good. So I'm just taking the screws out of the back plate. So that's the starting shaft back plate, and that gives me access to actually look at the connecting rod, or the piston rod, as some people may call it, and just throw some WD-40 into the piston head and piston connecting rod. So you can see that I was using a torch to just look at the condition of the actual crankcase inside, and I just used a small screwdriver just to push up the sleeve. You have to be careful when you do that not to mar the actual edge of the actual piston sleeve, just to make sure that it's better off using a plastic spatula than actually using a screwdriver. But if you're careful, you can get away with using a screwdriver. So there's me just taking the piston head out, and the actual crankshaft was pretty hard to push out. I don't know whether it's got too hot and expanded in there or what, I don't know, but it was pretty hard to get out. So you can see the front bearing I've taken out already, and to get the main bearing out of the crankcase you have to heat up the whole crankcase just to expand the case, so the bearing is easier to actually knock out. You'll understand what I'm saying when you just see the end of this process here of me heating up the crankcase. a couple of knocks, and there you go, the bearing comes out. This is the only method that works 100% of the time. I've seen people try to use tools to knock it out. You'll be there forever. This is the easiest way of doing it. So you can see that I'm just looking at the two different crankcases I've got there, just to see if one's been modified or it's slightly different compared to the old one. Because you've got to remember that the one on the left is probably 20 years old, or 15-20 years old, and the one on the right could be the same age or it could not be the same age. It depends on, you know, if that was off from a later batch that had been made or an early batch. You never know, so you always have to check to make sure like all the profiles and stuff like that are the same. So I'm just checking the bearing that's cooled down. I stuck it in some WD-40 just to quench it a little bit, and then now I was ready to put everything back together. So you're just wiping down the table to make sure I've got a bit of a clean area, because you don't want little bits and pieces stuck inside the engine. And I did wash the engine in with soap and water and dried it off, but I just took a little cotton bud and just got some IPA or brake cleaner and just wiped around the inside of the casing. So I'm just oiling the bearing slightly. Don't worry, it's so small, by the time that bearing gets flooded up with oil and stuff like that, that will all get mixed in with the actual nitro oil. It's just for the initial startup and me just testing the actual performance of the crankshaft. So you can see now I've got a big socket. That's probably the same diameter as the it's the same diameter as the bearing, and I just used it to home in the bearing into the crankcase wall. I shouldn't have used this socket, because the end of that socket, actually the chrome broke off while I was doing that, and little bits of chrome were inside the engine, so I had to go off and wash it again. I'd done that off camera, but I had to go and wash it again. And also the bearing wouldn't sit completely flat against the crankcase wall. I noticed when you use that socket, sometimes if you don't hit it dead on straight, the bearing still can go in tilted. When I think about it now, I'm thinking I should have heated up this crankcase and inserted the bearing, because that would have honed the bearing in properly. But you know, I persevered and got it in straight. And then I had trouble getting this crankshaft in. It seemed to me there was a burr somewhere, whether it is against the bearing, the crankcase housing, or the outer bearing that you can see there. It just wouldn't sit flush, or it wouldn't go pass through, so it will come out the other side. There was something always stopping it, and I couldn't really work out where it was stopping it. I didn't want to force it, because that could be bad, so I was just wondering if it's the bearing, the crankcase housing, or the clutch side bearing. So I'm just working it out now. I think I worked out in the end that the actual crankcase pass-through hole was actually a smaller diameter. So it looks like to me that the old crankcase had worn through with that crankshaft, and this case the hole was at the original size. So it looks like to me whether that crankshaft had expanded and it wouldn't pass through, or they could have been made differently. So I was just trying to use some wet and dry with a bit of oil, and just sort of sand down all the rough patches, all the staining and all that on the actual crankshaft, to see if that will make anything better. Or, well, I was just sanding down everything to see if it will make things better. Then I was using like a needle file just to take the burr of the actual crankcase down, and see if that will work. You're talking about really small filing and stuff like that, just so you can just get it in, and that's about it. It's, you know, you're taking off minimum amounts of material. So I noticed there, if you put it in the other way, it was the actual, yeah, you see, I've put it in the old one, it goes through nicely. But if I put it in this new crankcase, it gets stuck. See, it gets stuck. So I kind of had to give it a little bit of forcing backwards, but I realised at a later date that this wasn't really good for the engine when I did this. Even though I got it to fit after that, it wasn't really good for the engine, and you'll find that out in a later video. So now I've got it to fit, I'm just taking any bits of metal dust out of there. As I said, I did wash it again after this, just to make sure I haven't got any like filings and stuff like that. And now I'll fit the crankshaft in, sorry, and it fits nice now. So I'm just testing the fit of the crankshaft, and then I start to fit the piston in with the connecting rod. Then also I fit the piston sleeve. So I'm just being careful with the piston sleeve, because it seems like when I was pushing the piston sleeve down and homing it in, the engine and, well, the actual piston and the crank shaft got a little bit stiff in, just as it goes up to top dead center, which is up the very highest point. It seemed like it got very stiff, and then I had to hold down the sleeve for it to for it to sort of bed in a little bit. So, you know, I'll put a little bit of oil in there just to sort of help it bed in a little bit. So that's me putting in the front bearing to the crankcase. And then realised that I couldn't get that bearing in without upsetting the geometry of the whole crankshaft and the connecting rod and the piston. So I had to take everything back out again, just so I can get that bearing in. So now that bearing's in, I'll just reassemble the crankshaft into the crankcase, and then I'll put the copper bearing washer on.
If you're just joining us, it is T-minus 2 hours and 16 minutes until the fourth astronaut launch for SpaceX and NASA's Commercial Crew program. There you see in the foreground, Commander Roger Chari, next to him, pilot Tom Markstone, and to either side of those two are our mission specialists. Kayla Barron and Matthias Maurer are strapped into their
So I'll just use a screwdriver so the exhaust port from the piston sleeve lines up for the exhaust port of the actual crankcase, and then I test it a few times to make sure that the piston has got free movement.
Once we arrive on the International Space Station, we will run a lot of experiments.
Then I put the start shaft on with the backing plate.
Because fundamental changes in the way we understand how our world will be on the planet and just understand and operate on our Earth even better. One of the first, certainly today's perhaps most prominent internet. To enter a new era of human spaceflight.
And then I'll put new screws into the backing plate.
On one side, but there are also commercial astronauts who come up to run maybe their own science programs.
So I'm always rotating the piston to make sure that it has free movement every time I put a component back onto the engine. I always rotate the piston, rotate the crankshaft, just to make sure I haven't done anything. So at this point I've put in the pull starter on, and I noticed at the bottom of the pull starter there's like a little plastic section that's missing. I think there's meant to be a gasket there. So when I was tightening down on the actual starter, it was bending the plastic. So I took those two screws off and then just shimmed 2 washers in that gap. So when I tighten down, it doesn't bend the plastic towards the back plate. So you can just see me here just getting 2 washers. I think there's meant to be a gasket there, and it was either unavailable or I just couldn't get it in time of me building the engine.
And NASA astronaut Kayla Barron will be making her first trip to space today. The submarine warfare officer has
Ended up using 2 washers in the end. Right, so that's me fitting on the cooling head. With this cooling head, I had to put it's not the wrong screws, but all the heads on the screws were different. Like one was like 1.5 mil, one was 2 mil, and stuff like that. So I just used the best screws I had, because I think some of these, when they came out, were rounded off. So I just put as many screws in to the cooling head as possible and tightened it down. I just done it in a star shape, just to get the engine back together. I don't have to remember too much if it's together or loose or anything like that. So I'm just putting the pinch bolt in for the carburetor. Now remember, the carburetor has a Thunder Tiger Pro 21 carb needle, low setting carb needle in there. Which works fine. So I'm just putting the flywheel on. So I'm just using some mole grips here to hold the flywheel in place before I can actually tighten up the pilot shaft. It looks like I'm tightening it up quite a lot here, but because the washer is actually pinch washer. It tightens down until it stops. So, and I'm always testing the pull start because I've had a nightmare with it.
We also use these pressurized gases to spin the MVAC engine has to start up. All of those engines need the helices. They're also used for attitude control. Comes back down toward a landing on, and we also use the gas. We're continuing to monitor weather that came through here. Yes, there was. There's a little bit of rain, a light storm going for the officers. Whether or not we are go for long. We're back inside the capsule now. We're waiting. That's close.
So you can see that spinning very nice. The roller bearings in this engine are very good for some strange reason. Normally they're a little bit loose, but with this engine, it looks like the roller bearings were quite new. So as I'm thinking about the exhaust gasket, because I didn't have one to hand, so I'm putting the filter on while I'm thinking about what I can use as an exhaust gasket, because I was just going to put the exhaust straight onto the engine, but I thought I need some sort of paste, so I've got some gasket sealer here, and I just decided to just paint a small bit of gasket sealer around the exhaust manifold, just to give it a little bit of a seal, while thinking in my head I'll get the proper gasket, or I'll make one out of a bit of gasket. I'll buy some gasket paper and make my own one. So I'm just putting a little bit of paste for now. I'm not putting a lot, just a thin coating where it'll just make that little bit of a seal, and it'll be good enough for testing purposes, because I plan to start this engine up, but not with the wheels on, just so it starts okay and it shifts gears and stuff like that before the major strip down and rebuild. So looks like I've all got it all together. I'm very happy with that, because I didn't think I would have got that engine back together so quickly. So I'm very happy with that. So I'll just go ahead and put it onto the original chassis. Got to remember, this is the actual car chassis I'm using. So now I can put the original M3 screws in. I'm just looking for the ones with the right length, and also I get 4 washers together.
But what is something as a first timer they will experience that you just can't train for? So it's how you move around, how you fish without crashing into things or without knocking things off the wall. Learning stories about him. He's a veteran astronaut just like you. Flew on a shuttle, been up to the station. So you got any good stories about Tom?
So I'll just put a little bit of blue Loctite just to keep it in place. With this chassis, it's all original, so all the original engine mount holes haven't been touched or anything like that. So I'm putting a bit of Loctite for the first initial screw bolt down, and after that I won't put any, because you won't really need it. Correctly chilled before we load those into the Falcon 9, beginning at T-35 minutes. Now for the range and the weather, the range continues to be go. We are continuing to release balloons. We have been getting ballooned accordingly. Right, that's it. Looks like it's complete. I give it a little bit of a spin just to make sure everything's all right. And that's it. It's me packing up. I must say I'm not happy with the carb linkage on this car, and at a later date I do address that, because it's just way off and I've never liked it from the start. So but I do address that at a later date. Anyway, thanks for watching. So make sure you subscribe and click on the bell for any more videos that will be dropped. I'll be releasing the same video with some music behind it. So if you just want to have a look at what I'm doing and just chill to some beats, you're welcome to. So that'll be released probably tomorrow or the next day. So anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.